Welcome back to Scenic Painting 101. Today I'd like to show you how to simulate a brick wall using stenciling. First I'll lay in a mortar color and add some spatter. Then I'll stencil on my bricks. I'll do a little highlight and shadow around each brick and finish with a toning wash. Here I have a stencil that's been cut out of 1/8 inch Luan plywood. You notice it has a batten on one end. I use that to sort of move the stencil around. If you have your stencil made out of softer material, you'll probably want to add these battens all the way around the outside edge of your stencil in a frame. Thin plywood like this makes a good stencil material because it's super durable. But if you have a more delicate design with a lot of little nooks and crannies, it can be hard to work your paint into all those little holes. So for more delicate designs, you're going to want to make your stencil out of something thinner, such as stencil paper, also known as oil board. And it's a heavyweight coated paper, coated to make it waterproof. It comes in 24 inch by 36 inch sheets, or you can even buy it in big rolls. My personal favorite stencil material, though, is Herculean drafting film, 4 mil thick. And so I'm going to show you how I cut my stencils out of drafting film. So let's get started. When you're stenciling, it's best to have at least 2 matching stencils that you can alternate between, so that as one gets wet with paint, you can set it aside to dry while you use the other one to keep painting. Sometimes you might need to fold or cut a stencil to get into a corner. So when I cut stencils, I like to stack 3 sheets of film and cut 3 at once, so that I have 2 working stencils plus one that I won't mind cutting up. I tape my stencil material down onto my work surface so that it doesn't move around while I cut. You want to have a surface under your stack that is not too hard and not too soft, that you don't mind getting scratched or cut up, and that doesn't have a discernible grain pattern that can deflect your knife blade from the line you're trying to cut. Foam core or mat board work pretty well, but not corrugated cardboard or plywood. This will protect the surface of your work table and keep your knife from getting dull. I'm using a material called Homosote. I've already drawn a 2-inch border around the outside of my stencil. This is so that I have some space to attach my frame when I want to do that later. I'm going to lay out 8.5 inch by 2.5 inch bricks. Common bricks are generally around 2¼ inch by 8 inch, but I find that it makes your layout a lot quicker if you can just keep your dimensions to multiples of 1/2 inch. It just simplifies matters. So I'm going to lay out 2.5 inch brick, 1/2 inch mortar, 2.5 inch brick, 1/2 inch mortar, 2.5 inch, 1/2 inch, 2.5 inch, 1/2 inch, and so on. You do this on both sides. And then you do your tops and bottoms. On the top and bottom, you're going to go 4 inch and then 1/2 inch all the way across. 4 inch, 1/2 inch. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1/2. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1/2. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1/2. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1/2. Okay. I've already done my bottoms here. And we're going to connect our horizontal lines You want to be very accurate when you lay these out. It's very important that the right half matches the left half of your stencil and the top matches the bottom, because as you paint this you're going to overlap your stencil to pick up unpainted areas as you move along your wall, and you want your overlaps to match. That's called registering the stencil when you have a repeated design and you overlap to match your spacing. Got a little off on that line. Let's fix that. It's worth taking your time when you do your layout, because this is going to be repeated all over your wall and you want it to look good. After you've done your horizontals, you're going to do your verticals, and you're going to skip every other brick here so that you give your bricks the offset look. If you feel the need before you cut, you can erase these little areas in here that you won't be cutting. I usually don't bother with that. I just pay attention when I'm cutting not to go too far. Oops. Mistake. This drafting paper is made for architectural drawing. It's really a nice surface to draw on, to erase on. You can draw on it with pencil or ink. To erase ink, you just use an X-Acto knife and you scrape away the ink where you don't want it. This is what we used to use before we did all our drafting on computer, and we would need a transparent paper to make blueprints. Okay, so now that I'm all laid out, I'm ready to start cutting. You always want to start with a good sharp knife. I usually start with a fresh blade in my matte knife. A sharp knife is safer than a dull one because you don't need to exert as much pressure on the blade to make your cut, and you can focus more on control. If you need to use a straight edge to guide your blade, you can do that. With bricks, it's not that important to be extremely straight. It's okay if there's little variations because bricks tend to be chipped or otherwise uneven. So you can cut out all three, the whole brick at a time. What I find more efficient though is to actually go across and do all of my horizontal lines. Making sure you don't go too far because you don't want to weaken your mortar stencil there. And then I'll go back and do my vertical lines. This saves me from changing the direction of my wrist as often, and I find it's just an easier, quicker way to cut. If you're going for an older brick look, you might want to round over your corners like this. But you can actually do that rounding over as part of your painting process. And the rounding is a little bit difficult to do on the cutting, so I generally just cut straight corners. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up this job, and then we'll pick up later with the painting. Your base coat will be the color of the mortar in between the bricks. This would usually be a light gray color, but it could be darker, almost to black, or it could have brown tones mixed in. I usually just lay in a single color for this, but sometimes you might be wanting to go for a particular effect where your walls get darker at the top or towards your offstage edges, in which case you would scumble in a couple of different colors, a dark and a light, for a fade. But here I'm just going to lay in one solid color. And then after I apply my base color, I will often do a light spatter over the top. When we spatter, we usually like to put our flats on the floor so that the droplets have some space to spread out before they hit the flat. The farther away from the unit you can get, the more you'll get more of a spread you'll get on your droplets. And you just tap it on your hand and just give it a light spatter. You might want to go with a darker and a lighter color. I'm just going with one single dark color here. Okay, we'll have to let that dry before we can do any more. We're ready to start stenciling. I recommend starting at the top of your wall. And if you have a corner that the audience can see around, where you want your bricks to wrap around, I would recommend starting with that edge. There are a lot of different ways that you can apply the paint when you're stenciling. You could spray it, you could dab it on with a sponge or a brush, you could brush it on. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use a little mini roller. I'm just going to roll it on. And then I'm going to add a little bit of extra color with some sponges. You want to be careful not to overload your roller or sponges, because if you have too much paint on your painting tool, you'll push the paint up under the edge of your stencil. Also, you may need to hold your stencil down as you go to keep it from moving. Sometimes you might even use little pieces of masking tape to hold it in place as you go. Sometimes you might want to get full coverage. Other times you might leave a little bit of your mortar color showing through. You just have to experiment with different techniques and see what works for you. Okay, I'm just going to dab in a little bit of some other colors here to make it a little more interesting. I kind of like to spread it around a little bit. I've got two different colors here. Try to be sort of random with it, and then I can blend it out if I want to blend it out. You want to keep from getting sort of a same repetitive pattern when you do this. So if you don't turn your sponge around, you might get sort of the same image repeating, which will look funny to people. The human eye is really very good at picking up patterns, so people will detect things like that. So once you're satisfied with what it looks like, you will just remove your stencil and you move it to the next position, overlapping what you've just done to make sure that you have an equal spacing on your mortar joints. I want to work the paint out of the roller and start applying. You don't want your paint to be too watery when you do this. I worked out a little bit too much there, I think. If your paint is watery, it's going to have more of a tendency to creep. So you just have to come up with the right consistency on it. When I'm painting, I always like to have a damp rag handy. It's better to have one near you and not need it than to suddenly need one and have to run into the shop and grab something. So I may or may not need one here, but I always keep a damp rag nearby when I paint. Okay, good enough. Got one more run to do, it looks like. It's a little awkward with the little stripe at the bottom, but that's okay. And just have a little extra wide mortar joint on the bottom. A lot of times the bottom of your wall you'll do something different with anyway. You might do a little gray stripe like a concrete base. soak a bunch of brown paint in there like it's dirty down at the bottom of the wall. Oh, okay, so you see what I did here. I didn't offset my bricks, so that's a silly mistake I just made you want to avoid. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my rag, I'm going to wipe it off. Let's try that again. I guess I didn't line up my verticals, I just lined up my horizontals there. No, I made that mistake. That was silly of me. Being able to fix your mistakes is always a valuable skill, because everybody makes mistakes. I started adding in some shadow and highlight to the mortar areas. If you know which direction the light is coming from on your stage, then you can figure out which sides should get the highlight and which sides should get the shadow. You will usually shadow underneath the bricks and on the side of the mortar that's closer to center stage, and you'll highlight on the top of the brick and on the side of the mortar that's closer to the off stage. I usually like to do my horizontal lines and then go back and hit my verticals. Sometimes I might want to do a little blending with my finger, or if you have a rag handy, it's a little cleaner. You want your paint to be nice and thin so it flows from the brush. This is actually a little on the heavy side here. It's nice if it's just a nice wash that allows your mortar spatter to show through. If it's too washy though, if it's too wet and there's no binder, then it may get rubbed off when you do your final toning wash. So you don't want to have it too watery. You can use a lining stick to guide you. Give yourself nice straight lines, or you can freehand it. With bricks, it doesn't have to be incredibly straight, although some bricks are very regular and neat. Alright, I'm going to go back and do our highlight. Another thing with highlighting and shadow is that you don't necessarily need to do continuous lines all the way across. It's okay if it stops and starts. Sometimes that actually looks better. And depending on the sort of the age and the wear and the regularity of the bricks that you're trying to simulate. Your designer will let you know what kind of look they're going for. If you walk around the city and look at brick walls, you'll notice that you really don't see a lot of highlight and shadow on most brick walls. Most bricklayers are very careful when they lay the bricks. The mortar is almost flush with the surface of the bricks, so you don't get a lot of highlight and shadow under and around. But in the theater, we need to sort of heighten all the details so that they show up at a distance and under the stage lighting conditions, varying conditions of brightness or darkness. So we always want things to look a little bit more emphasized. The relationship of scene painting to realistic painting is like the relationship between street makeup and stage makeup, or no makeup at all. Alright, that's it for the highlight and shadow. One more step and we'll be finished. You might want to finish your piece with a toning wash. This ties all the colors together and its age. You want this to be really watery so that it doesn't totally obscure your look. If you feel like it's too heavy, you can always go back with a rag and wipe it off in areas. Applying it with a sprayer also allows you to have a lot of control over how heavily you put it on. You can just kind of remove it here and there, leave some areas heavy. One of the techniques I like to use on old walls is dripping it on from the top. Throwing some spatter on the bottom. Guide the drips if you feel that adds to it. Other techniques you might want to try are plaster over the old brick or old paint that's chipped off. And basically you just want to give the wall some history so it looks like it's been around for a while. That's it. Being able to lay out, cut, and use stencils will be valuable additions to your scene painting skill set. Anytime you need to repeat a pattern or image over a large area, you can use stencils to speed up the repetitive layout work. Thanks for watching.